Hello everyone. This lecture covers sculpture, installation, site-specific art, and 3D design. It corresponds to the content of Chapter 11 in Understanding Art, 11th edition. The learning objectives for this chapter include using basic vocabulary for sculptural techniques and materials, being able to describe contemporary methods and materials that expand the traditional definition of sculpture, explain the major categories of works of art that are site-specific, and summarize major factors relevant to the process of industrial design. So we start the chapter with the story of Pygmalion, who was from the ancient Greek mythology in the Ovid's poem of the Metamorphosis, and in it Pygmalion is a sculptor who is highly dedicated to his craft. He puts it above his social life, getting married. He's just totally dedicated to his art form, and eventually he crafts sculpture so beautiful that he falls in love with it, and he says a prayer or makes a wish that it could possibly come to life, and Venus, the goddess of love, hears his prayer and grants his wish. So his sculpture is coming to life right before our eyes. So you can see the change happening. Pygmalion gets his one true love, something that he created himself. And the book says, the myth of Pygmalion has been depicted in many versions and mediums, a subject that has suggested both the technical prowess of sculptors and the power to create the illusion of reality, in spite of the harsh, seemingly unforgiving materials with which they work, marble, wood, and bronze. Another example of this highly technical ability is this sculpture by Bernini of Apollo and Daphne. And this is just a really good example of how transformative sculptors can be, from taking a chunk of marble and making it look like fabric, making it look like skin, making it look like tree branches. I mean, it's very just kind of amazing. Seeing this in person certainly would even be more of an experience. It's hard to imagine that this was once just a block of stone. And just keep in mind that realism is just one stylistic dimension of sculpture. Certainly we're going to see some examples of other ways in which sculptors have transformed those materials. So let's start with just talking about the difference between relief sculpture and in the round sculpture. In relief sculpture, figures or images project to varying degrees from a two-dimensional plane, so they're attached to some kind of background. Low relief is also called bas relief, and it doesn't stick out a whole lot, just a little bit. Think about like a quarter, right? The words and the picture of George Washington on it, they're raised up from the background a little bit. So low relief just projects a little bit, and high relief projects a lot. So here's an example of high relief sculpture. The figures are both attached to that background. In sections, they're completely detached, like the arms and the leg of the man. But for the most part, they are completely attached to some kind of background. So high relief sticks out a lot, low relief just a little bit. And then we also have sunken relief, in which the carving is actually sunken into the background. It's carved down inside, so sunken down. Freestanding sculpture, or sculpture in the round, is not connected to a two-dimensional background. It's carved, cast, or assembled in 3 dimensions. You can walk all the way around it, look at it 360 degrees. So 2 other terms that we want to be able to use with sculpture are additive and subtractive. So all sculptural processes are one or the other, sometimes actually both. So subtractive is when the material is removed from the original mass to create an image. So a wood carving, you have a block of wood or a block of stone, and the sculptor carves pieces away and is left with a form. Additive is sculpture that is formed from building up or adding to reach the desired form. So in this particular case, the artist has taken a whole bunch of individual pieces and added them together. Okay, so we're going to talk about some techniques for sculpture. Carving, the sculptor starts with a block of material and cuts portions of it away until the desired form is created. Carving could be considered the most demanding type of sculpture because the sculptor, like a fresco painter, must have a clear conception of the final product at the outset. So the material chosen, stone, wood, or whatever, strongly influences the mechanics of the carving process and determines the type of creation that will emerge. The example of sculpture that we're looking at is one of Michelangelo's unfinished sculptures. He had a collection that he had started when he passed away, and so they almost look like they are literally emerging from these raw, uncut stones. And Michelangelo is famous for having that kind of the phrase that the sculpture was already in the block of stone. It was just his job to remove everything that wasn't part of the sculpture, which is a very poetic and beautiful way to kind of think about it. If the idea that it's already finished inside that block and you just have to take away everything. So this is an example. Carving is a subtractive sculptural process. Modeling is when you use a pliable material like clay or wax and you shape it into three-dimensional form. So unlike carving, the artist doesn't necessarily have to begin with a clear concept of the result. You can work and rework the material until a pleasing form begins to emerge. So in this case, modeling is both additive and subtractive. So an artist can start with a block of clay, carve some away, maybe add some back on. So in this case, modeling can be additive and subtractive. Carving, once you carve a piece of stone away, it's not going back on. So for the most part, carving is only subtractive. Casting is when a liquid material is poured into a mold, and that liquid hardens into the shape of the mold, and then the mold is removed. In casting, an original model is usually made out of something like wax or clay, even styrofoam, and it can be translated into a more durable material like bronze. The mold is like a photographic negative. It's like the reverse of it. So it only looks like the form. It doesn't have anything to do with color. And then the interior surfaces of the mold carry the reversed impressions of the model's exterior. So this example we're looking at is a cast bronze sculpture that the artist then gave a white patina, which is kind of a surface covering to give it a certain color. Lost wax casting is the most traditional and the oldest form of casting with bronze, and this little video is from the Cleveland Museum of Art, and I'm just going to play it quite short, but it shows you the process, which is, of course, much easier to understand when you can see it happening.
The ancient metalsmiths of Costa Rica, Panama, and Colombia were masters of lost wax casting, which they used to create intricate gold ornaments of many kinds. This animation reconstructs the stages involved in casting one Panamanian pendant, but the principles also apply to other cast objects from the region. Many are on view in the Ancient Americas Gallery. The process started with making the wax model. First, a clay form in the general shape of the ornament was created. Next, a wax model of the ornament was built up over the form. Then, wax details were added to the model. The next stage involved making the mold. Wax vents and a wax sprue or pouring channel were attached to the model. Their precise locations haven't been identified on this ornament, which could have been cast upside down. The model was covered with a slurry of water, clay, and powdered charcoal, which was allowed to dry. Importantly, when it did, it captured an exact, detailed impression of the model's surface. The model was encased in a clay-based mixture, which dried to form a hard mold. In the process, the inner clay form was attached to the mold. Then the casting was made. The mold was heated to a very high temperature to melt the wax, which was poured out or lost. This gives the process its modern name. The resulting void was shaped like the wax model due to the dried slurry. The inner clay form remained in place because it was attached to the mold. The mold was then reheated and molten gold alloy was poured into it, taking the place of the wax. Gases escaped through the vents, sprue, and porous clay mold. When the gold had cooled and solidified, the outer mold and inner clay form were removed, freeing the casting. The gold in the sprue and the vents was also removed and probably used elsewhere. Now the ornament was ready for surface finishing, such as polishing. In the past, lost wax casting was used in many parts of the world and remains in use today.
Okay, here we have an example of a cast statue. Many art sculptors start with a form out of clay or wax, and then oftentimes, depending on their abilities to finance it, they don't always have the ability to get them cast into bronze right away, just because of the amount of money that costs in having that done. A lot of times, you have to have it done at a foundry. Degas had a number of sculptures that did not get cast into bronze until after his death, and I believe these were done ahead of time, or like before he died. And he made the choice to actually add real clothing to them, which people found to be really intriguing. The idea of that contrast between the metal of the human form, which looks very realistic, but then also adding real clothes to it, just gave it even more of a lifelike quality. And George Segal made these sculptures, and originally they were cast with plaster strips using live models. So they would have been done in sections, wrapping the plaster around parts of the person's body and then removed and then put together to make the full figures. And then actually they took it a step further and cast those into bronze. But the artist made the choice to paint them white to make it look like the plaster sculptures. So it's kind of interesting because the plaster probably doesn't have quite the amount of durability that bronze does. So while he used plaster in order to get a very realistic, lifelike sculpture, because he was using actual humans, then to make it last longer, he went and had those cast into bronze. Constructed sculpture is when an artist builds or constructs the sculpture from materials like cardboard, celluloid, translucent plastic, sheet metal, or wire, frequently creating forms that are lighter than those made from carving stone, modeling clay, or casting metal. Sometimes the wood might be cut, some things might be painted, they are attached together with like nails or glue, so it's literally the idea of constructing something. And assemblage is a form of constructed sculpture, so you're still constructing by taking different objects and putting them together. But a lot of times assemblage is pre-existing or found objects, so things that you might already recognize. You look in this sculpture by Louise Nevelson, you can probably see like finials from furniture, like a table base, things like banisters, or maybe like the posts from a bed frame, things like that are recognizable as everyday objects that she has reappropriated into sculptural pieces. So they kind of take on a new life and a new meaning. Kinetic sculpture is actually sculpture that moves. So movement can be caused by the wind or magnetic fields, jets of water, electric motors, variations in the intensity of light, or the active manipulation of the observer. So I'll show you a different sculpture by George Rickey, but it's the same concept, that these forms that he's made move in space when the wind blows them. So kind of cool, the idea that they're kind of always changing, and you always get like kind of a different combination of forms from the wind. Light sculpture is when an artist works with light, and Dan Flavin specifically usually works with fluorescent tubes, but any kind of light would work, and so artists are concerned with how the light colors mix together, how the light affects the space in which it would be displayed. So not a whole lot else to say about light sculpture, except it's done with light. Let's talk about some materials used for sculpture. Stone is a very labor-intensive material to be working with. You can see some of the hand tools that are used, chisels, mallets, rasps. Not a lot of those have changed much over the centuries, and you can see a picture of an artist using those tools, and you can see, pulling away small pieces of the stone. Like I mentioned, very labor intensive, and once you carve something away, it's gone. There's no way to reattach it when it comes to working with stone. This example by Louise Bourgeois shows both really highly polished areas of the stone versus parts that are left more in their raw state. So as artists are carving, certainly you're going to see the texture formed from the tools. You're going to see kind of those like raw, just chipped away at areas. And then they can always go back with finer materials and use some other materials to polish them and give them like a high glossy shine. So in this sculpture, they've incorporated both the kind of raw block of stone, but also some highly polished and finished areas. Wood can be carved and you can work with blocks of wood versus laminated sheets of wood. Wood has pretty good tensile strength and durability. A lot of times artists have to work with the grain of the wood, makes it easier for carving. And like I mentioned, you can carve wood, gouge into it, cut it, assemble it, and it can be polished. Here's a couple of examples of wood sculpture. So the one called Droga is done with sheets of wood, and you can kind of see the individual like pieces that have been put together, and then the artist has gone back and carved into them. She's left a lot of the kind of just raw texture of the wood where it's been cut, giving it this very textured surface. Kind of creates this idea of like some kind of like creature moving along on the floor, versus the other sculpture called Figure, which is very highly polished and finished. It is a constructed sculpture, so there's there's little hidden drawers that pull out, but you can see that the artist has created a surface that's much more polished and finished, because you see that shine from the wood finish on it. Clay is a naturally occurring material. It's more pliable than wood or stone, meaning it's able to be like squished and moved around more easily. Works often preserve the evidence of the artist's hands directly handling the medium, sometimes. Clay has little strength, so it's not typically considered a permanent material unless it's exposed to heat, as in ceramic. So it has to be fired in order to be more durable and permanent. Sculptors have always used clay to make three-dimensional sketches or models that are then cast into more durable materials, such as bronze. The example that we have here is by Michael Doolan, and it is a finished piece. So this clay has been fired to a permanent state and then painted with that bright yellow color. It's very kind of making little playful references to children's toys. Metal can be cast, extruded, forged, stamped, drilled, filed, and burnished. And in recent years, artists have also assembled direct metal sculptures by welding, riveting, and soldering. Modern adhesives have made it possible to glue sections of metal together into three-dimensional constructions. And different metals have different properties: dull, glossy, different colors, and patinas. Richard Serra is the artist that we have an example of one of his sculptures that's displayed outside, and we'll come back to him a little bit later with our site-specific artwork. But this artwork is at the Storm King Art Center, which is a sculpture park, and so all of these sculptures at this sculpture park are outside and therefore react to all types of weather, and over time sometimes their surfaces change with being outside. Here's two other examples of sculptures from that sculpture park, and once again there you can see with the people. I'm gonna see if I can get it to get a little bit more in focus there. Well, I guess those are just going to be a little bit blurry. But you can see the size of them with the people in the photograph on the right. They are big metal sculptures, and like I mentioned, they are sculptures that live outside all the time. So over time, the weather, temperature affects them. Things might start to collect on them, and so the sculpture park has that opportunity to either clean them off or just let nature do its thing. Other sculpture materials can include fabric. In this particular case, Claes Oldenburg was an artist who often made everyday objects into sculptures of much larger sizes. So he worked with fabric vinyl for a while, making these very large, kind of floppy sculptures. This particular one is an oversized toilet. It is supposed to be humorous. The idea of a sculpture that's a toilet is already kind of funny, but the idea that then he makes it out of this very floppy kind of fabric makes it a little bit more ridiculous. But this is vinyl that's been painted. And Kiki Smith is an artist who does a lot of work about the human body, and her sculptures are often made out of beeswax. She references a lot of just the functions that the human body goes through, aging, bodily fluids, things like that. And she notes that most of the functions of the body are hidden from society, and so part of her work is to bring them out into the open. And she does a lot of her displays about that. And part of that has to do with her experience as an EMT in New York City and just her daily interactions with the human body. This artist has made her sculptures out of styrofoam. So this is literally the kind of styrofoam that's used in packaging and shipping, and she has incorporated it to make her forms. And so they're probably a little bit fragile, but also very, very fun looking. And once again, we come back to Janine Antoni's Gnaw sculpture, which is a 1,600-pound piece of chocolate that she gnawed. And I think the rest of this exhibit also has some other materials like beeswax and lard. And I think that it's worth mentioning that the textures that she creates on her sculptures records the process, and that's the most important element of art making for this artist, which is a little different from some of the other sculptural techniques that we've seen. That's not so much focused on the process of how it was made, right? Think back to that Bernini sculpture at the beginning, with Daphne and Apollo, right? Like, the idea is not to think about that it was chiseled. It's like to marvel at its beauty in its finished form. So in this case, this is a highly different approach for sculpture. Installations are when an artist incorporates, pretty much takes over a space. So it's three-dimensional works that can be site-specific, but the idea is that they transform a space. It can be a gallery, a garden, or some other kind of environment. Sometimes installations are temporary, and sometimes they are permanent. This particular one was at a design center in Los Angeles, and the artist hung hundreds and hundreds of these. They were kind of inspired by kites, paper structures from the ceiling. So sometimes it's for a temporary time, and sometimes the idea is that it's there forever. Site-specific art is produced in or for one specific location, and in theory, it's not supposed to be relocated. Doesn't always happen, but for the most part, it's not supposed to be relocated. The term came into use in the 1960s and 70s as a blanket category for art that was created for or in a specific location. And we're going to look at some land or environmental art, ephemeral art, public art, and some monuments. So we showed a sculpture by Richard Serra just a little while ago. He is a great example, this particular piece, of a site-specific work. He was commissioned to make a sculpture for this location. It's it's outside of a building in New York City, an office building, and the square that's in front of the building was somewhere where people came to eat lunch and just walk to get from building to building. And in this case, he created this large, it's called it tilted arc, and it pretty much just created a barrier. So people were having to walk around it. It blocked off like a fountain, and so it actually was pretty controversial. People didn't like the fact that they now couldn't walk through like more directly through this space, and they had to encounter it. And that was kind of Richard Serra's point, was to kind of force them to encounter this art. But this piece has since been removed and destroyed because it was it's very controversial. So site-specific work can sometimes end up being removed. This is a land art piece by Robert Smithson. It's called Spiral Jetty, and this was made in the Great Salt Lake in Utah. And so this is a good example of land art, and that's site-specific work that's created or marked by an artist within its natural surroundings. And this was created by bulldozing rocks and earth into that spiral shape. Remember, we've seen that spiral shape before when we've talked about lines and things like that. It's a very kind of ancient design motif that's been around. Humans have been doing spirals and finding spirals in nature for all of time. Throughout its history, the spiral jetty has sometimes been completely submerged under the water, and then sometimes showing partially. I'm not totally sure exactly how it looks right now, but you could maybe find it on Google Earth and see what it looks like right now. I know the Great Salt Lake is experiencing possibly some serious issues in the future of drying out, so maybe you can see the whole thing right now. Andy Goldsworthy is maybe one of the most well-known land artists. He's an artist who would go out into the wilderness and create his art entirely with materials from the earth. He did not use any other materials to connect the pieces together to get them to stay. So a lot of times it required days and days, maybe even weeks of practice to figure out how to get it right. The one on the left, Ice Star, these were pieces of ice that were dipped into water and then kind of held together so that it would actually freeze in the orientation that he wanted them to, kind of like if you glue something and you have to kind of hold it for a little bit to let it set up, that kind of thing. So his sculptures take a lot of patience. They take a lot of trial and error. And then the only documentation of them is the photographs or any films that are done of them when they are being created and then finished. They don't ever leave their natural environment, and they are just left there to decompose, melt, fade away, however they meet their end. These are a couple of other Andy Goldsworthy sculptures. And so the image on the right, the rocks, he did break the rocks, and you can kind of see where he's scratched them to maybe bring attention to their the negative space there. And then the snow pieces on the left are they're entirely just from his own construction technique to build them in that circular format. They're not being held together with anything but just natural forces of gravity. This is a piece that is unusual because it was done on an iceberg. The artist got about, I think the textbook said 780 gallons of safe dye. It's dye that's used to tint meat in the meat production process, and it was all sprayed over this iceberg. And I believe at this time, at least according to the book, which I guess it is a few years old, but it is still visible to this day. So the dye in the iceberg, as conditions change, melt into the water. And I don't know tons about this sculpture, but I'm assuming that it was given the okay that it was safe to do, and you're allowed to spray icebergs with safe dyes. And Walter de Maria made this piece called The Lightning Field. And this is an example of land art that requires nature to be part of the art. In this case, it's 400 polished stainless steel poles into the ground, and that's not really the art itself. It's what happens when nature reacts to the poles. So lightning is attracted to these poles, and so the only documentation is when the lightning strikes and it's photographed. So it requires there to be cameras on hand, and it requires certain weather conditions. And so this is certainly a work of art that relies on nature to have it happen. Christo and Jean-Claude are also some very well-known site-specific artists. They were husband and wife that did these pieces that lasted maybe a couple of weeks to a couple of months. Their pieces sometimes took years to get approved so that they would be allowed to do them, because they had to go through a lot of red tape in terms of getting permission and making sure that how they affected the land when they left and removed the pieces would, the earth would not be harmed. So this particular piece we're looking at is called The Gates, and it was done in Central Park. And if you look at the dates of it, it's 1979 through 2005. That's how long it took them. And of course, they worked on other things in the meantime, but it took that long for them to be able to plan the entire thing, get permission, and then gather volunteers. They rely a lot on volunteers to help them make these site-specific installations happen, and they are solely self-funded. So they don't take commissions, they don't take corporate funding. The only money that they make from their art was things like they would sell some of their preliminary drawings and things like that, but they were solely self-funded artists, and so sometimes their pieces took a long time to execute, just with everything that's involved with it. And we looked at Tsai Guo-Ching before with drawing, with those gunpowder drawings. And this is a piece that had to rely a whole lot on coordination. So getting permission from the New York City Fire Department, the Transit Authority, the Coast Guard, the Federal Air Administration for a 15-second work of art. It was this is an example of ephemeral art. It does not last forever. It was literally a fireworks display, and it required a lot of coordination for cameras to capture it. And once it happened, the only documentation are the photographs and the films from the event. And we're going to look at a couple of examples of public art. A lot of cities and towns will set aside a portion of their budget for beautification purposes to incorporate artwork into the city and town in order just to make it a more pleasing space to be. So this example is in New York City. Underneath some of the bridges, they have incorporated waterfalls for the purpose of beautification. Here is... Here we go. Okay. There's an example of a fountain in Central Park in New York City. So there are lots of cities and towns that will hold contests for public work submissions, and artists can present an idea that they have, and there's a committee or something like that to approve it. This is an example of a site-specific art installation in Barcelona, Spain. Originally, the idea for this space was to create a small community. The idea was that it was going to be a suburb where people would live. There would be maybe markets and public spaces. Eventually, the project didn't get finished, but Antoni Gaudi was the architect that they had designed all of these public sculptures. So there's sculptures, there's benches, there's walkways, there's this example of a mosaic in the ceiling in this particular walkway. Now this place that it is in is called Parkway. and it's just a place for the public to walk around and spend time. You have street musicians play there. It's a beautiful space. My husband and I went there when we were on our honeymoon, so there's a picture of me sitting in this space. As you can see behind me, the benches are all done with tiles and kind of recycled, broken pottery, things like that, to make all those mosaic benches. You might have seen this sculpture before. This is Cloud Gate by Anish Kapoor, and it is in Millennium Park in Chicago. It's also nicknamed like the bean, the giant bean, because it looks like a large bean. It's a stainless steel sculpture. It is a unique work of art in that the artist owns the rights to the sculpture, and therefore you actually are not allowed to take pictures of this sculpture and then sell the pictures for money. So this, of course, is something that gets probably a little bit sticky with taking public, if you create a work of art that's going to be in public, trying to control how people use the photos that they take of it can probably get a little bit complicated. And moving on to talk about monuments. The site-specific public art that we have looked at was designed or installed to enhance a particular open public space. So their main purpose is aesthetic, to create beauty or enhance the environment. Monuments comprise another category of site-specific public art. Their purpose is to preserve the memory of a person or an event. This is a picture of the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, Germany. The pieces of stone are all positioned very close together in a tight kind of claustrophobic space. It's designed to look overwhelming and very kind of chaotic, and while the sculptures themselves are kind of simple forms, the idea of their placement and everything is very much kind of supposed to give you an overwhelming feeling. Memorials can be very emotional, and so sometimes just even the design of them can arise a lot of feelings from people who may or may not have even been involved with the particular event that it's memorializing. This is the National World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C., and the design for this was actually criticized because a lot of people thought that it looked a lot like some of the monuments and memorials in Europe, specifically in Germany, and they thought that it was too connected to that look of some of the stuff that is in that part of the world. And it was like, well, we just fought people over there, and now we're designing a monument that looks a lot like theirs do. So this one was a highly debated memorial, as was the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. There's a great documentary about this, which we might come back to later in the semester. It was designed by Maya Lin, and she designed this V-shaped memorial that is positioned within the earth. So when you approach it, you kind of come into it on one end and can walk along till it reaches the point of the V, and then you exit at the other end. The names of the people inscribed on the black granite are placed in the order in which they died instead of being alphabetical. So there's a book that you can look up someone's name if you're trying to find them. This one was also highly controversial in that some people loved the design of it and some people really disliked it. And as I mentioned before, there are a lot of emotions associated with memorials, especially from the people who were involved in the event that they're memorializing. So that can be highly challenging for the people trying to get these things made. Okay, we're going to end with talking about industrial design. This refers to the design of three-dimensional products intended for consumer use. Industrial design runs the gamut from utilitarian design, form follows function, to those in which aesthetics override usability, so form over function. Many objects of contemporary industrial design take ergonomics, the applied science of equipment design intended to minimize discomfort and maximize performance, into account. Here's a great example of the form follows function, form over function that we just mentioned. So we have on the left side a citrus juicer, right? It's designed to do its job. So the form follows what the function needs to be. Just to squeeze the juice and get the juice out, or squeeze the fruit on the top, twist it around and get the juice. On the right hand side, you have a Philippe Starck juicer, and this is an example where it's form over function. The form took the priority and the function, whether or not it functioned well, was kind of not the priority. And actually, the manufacturer of this product actually recommends it more for display than for use, which makes you wonder, like, why even call it a juicer? Maybe it's just like a cool sculpture. When we talk about industrial design, this is something that taps into graphic design we talked about earlier with just even marketing. Apple is a company that we've mentioned a couple of times this semester with logo design and iconic shapes. Certainly, as they are designing their products, the aesthetics of the products are highly important to this company. Not only do they want their products to work well and be like functional, but the aesthetic qualities of the designs are really important in this company and many others as well. Sometimes the form takes the back seat to the function. So this is an example of 85 lamps lighting fixture, and it is literally just what it says. It is 85 light bulb sockets and 12 light bulbs, and they're all just connected together. So it's a little bit less on the beautification part, and just it is what it is. And lastly, just mentioning ergonomics. That's applied science of equipment design intended to minimize discomfort and maximize performance of the user. And hopefully some aesthetic qualities are in there as well. So not only does it need to look nice, but also function really well and help be kind of like the best it can be and help people use it for what it's supposed to be used for. And if you can have all of that in a package like this Aeron chair, you can really sell it as not only is it beautiful, but it is ergonomic. It's going to help you be the best office worker you can be. Okay, that's going to end our discussion about 3D media.